In the grand tapestry of world history, few events have resonated as profoundly as the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. The year before, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced radical reforms known as perestroika and glasnost in an attempt to address the USSR's growing pains. But these changes inadvertently set in motion a series of events that led to the dissolution of the Union and the end of the Cold War. Without these reforms, the Soviet Union might have successfully navigated the complexities of the late 20th century, shaping our world in profound ways. The global political stage today would undoubtedly be vastly different. In our timeline, the Soviet Union's collapse left the United States as the sole superpower, ushering in a new world order. However, if the USSR had remained intact, we would be living in a multipolar world with two dominant powers at the helm, the US and the Soviet Union. This bipolarity would have continued to shape global politics, potentially leading to a resurgence of the Cold War dynamics. For starters, NATO, which began as a bulwark against Soviet expansionism, might not have expanded so aggressively into Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and others might still be within the Soviet sphere of influence. This would have maintained a significant buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. And who knows, maybe the US wouldn't have attempted to put missiles in Poland either. Further, the impact on regions like the Middle East would be profound. The Soviet Union played a pivotal role in the region, supporting key allies like Egypt, Syria, and Libya. Without the collapse, these relationships might have continued to flourish, potentially leading to a different outcome in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Imagine if the Soviets were still around backing Assad in Syria right now. It could have really changed the course of that civil war. Economically, the picture becomes equally intriguing. On one hand, the Soviet economy was plagued with inefficiencies and stagnation by the late 20th century. If it had collapsed, then, well, we wouldn't have seen Russia's economic struggles in the 1990s and the rise of oligarchs. Now, on the other hand, if the Soviet Union had somehow managed to stay together, it's possible that they could have implemented successful reforms that would have transformed them into a robust mixed economy. You see, after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, many countries like Poland, Czechia, and Hungary adopted market-based economies and saw tremendous growth. The Soviet Union could have followed this path, leveraging its vast natural resources, especially oil and gas, to fuel industrial and technological advancements. But let's talk about the oil card up their sleeve. The Soviet Union was, and still is, rich in oil and gas reserves. After the collapse, these resources became a lifeline for Russia. But if the USSR had stayed together, it's likely that they would still control these resources, albeit perhaps with more environmentally friendly practices. This would mean that instead of Russian gas flowing through Ukrainian pipelines, we'd have Soviet gas flowing through there. And instead of Russia cozying up to China for economic partnerships, we'd see the Soviet Union forging closer ties with Beijing. With all of these potential economic benefits, the Soviet Union might have emerged as a global powerhouse with a strong currency and a thriving industrial sector. They could have been a leader in sectors like aerospace, defense, and advanced manufacturing, challenging American dominance in technology. However, one cannot ignore the darker aspects of the Soviet system. While it had its achievements in science and industry, it was built on principles of totalitarianism and state control. A continued Soviet Union would have meant that millions of people in Eastern Europe and Central Asia would still be living under a one-party state with limited freedoms and human rights. Without the collapse, many countries like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states might not have experienced the democratic transformations that shape them today. Speaking of Ukraine, things could have gone very differently. In our timeline, the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Euromaidan Uprising in 2014 brought Ukraine closer to the European Union and away from Russia. If the Soviet Union still existed, it's very possible that these pro-democracy movements might have been crushed, with the USSR labeling them as attempts to undermine Soviet authority. It's conceivable that Ukraine might have remained a Soviet republic with its strategic importance exploited without the same level of autonomy it enjoys today. Now let's venture into the realm of science and technology. Had the Soviet Union not collapsed, its contributions to various fields might have continued to shape our world in significant ways. For example, in space exploration, the Soviet Union was a pioneer. It sent the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit and the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space. If the USSR had thrived, it's very possible that we would be seeing more ambitious space projects with the Soviet flag, not just the American one. We might have had a Soviet space station, moon landing, or even plans to colonize Mars. Just imagine that. But the impact might not have been limited to space. The Soviet Union made significant advancements in nuclear energy, biotechnology, and materials science. Its scientists made vital contributions to our understanding of the universe, quantum mechanics, and the structure of matter. A continued Soviet Union could have fostered even more scientific progress, potentially leading to innovations we might not have seen otherwise. So here's a fun thought experiment. What if the Soviet Union is still around today? What would it be like? Well, first off, the name might be a little outdated. Maybe it's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics or something similar. The hammer and sickle flag might still be flying over Moscow, symbolizing a nation that spans across 11 time zones and 3 continents. Imagine a sprawling empire from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, encompassing the vast landscapes of Siberia and stretching all the way to the Pacific coast. Now let's talk about leadership. In our timeline, Vladimir Putin rose to power following Boris Yeltsin's resignation in 1999. But if the Soviet Union had not collapsed, Putin might not have become the prominent figure he is today. Perhaps we'd see someone like Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the USSR, leading a reformed Soviet Union into the 21st century. Or maybe there'd be someone entirely different. And what about society? Millions of people across Eastern Europe and Central Asia would still be living under a Soviet-style system, possibly with limited freedoms compared to the societies we know today. The cultural landscape would be very different, with heavy censorship, state-sponsored media, and a focus on socialist realism in art and literature. But one thing that might be similar is the emphasis on education and science. The Soviet Union placed a strong focus on education, producing many highly skilled engineers, scientists, and intellectuals. Without the collapse, this tradition might have continued, fostering innovation and advancements in various fields. Now let's shift our attention to foreign policy. In our timeline, Russia emerged as a major player on the international stage after the dissolution of the USSR. It reasserted its influence in areas like Eastern Europe and Central Asia and became a key player in conflicts like the Syrian Civil War. But if the Soviet Union had endured, Russia's role might have been more subdued. As part of a larger Soviet sphere, Russia might not have had the same level of international prominence, although tensions with NATO and the US might have continued. One area where the Soviet Union might have excelled is space exploration. As we discussed earlier, the USSR was a pioneer in this field, so it's possible that it would have continued to make significant strides in space travel, potentially leading to more ambitious missions and discoveries. In October of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, giving way to 15 independent republics from Latvia to Uzbekistan. In its place, a new world order emerged with the United States as the sole superpower. But what if this chain of events played out differently? What if the USSR survived and thrived? How would the world look today if the Soviet Union still existed? If the USSR had remained intact, the 21st century would be dominated by a world split into 2 spheres of influence. To simplify, there would be the Western Bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern Bloc, led by Moscow. There wouldn't be much room for neutrality, since powerful allies would force countries to pick a side. As a result, the world would be intensely divided. Globalization would fail to create the largely Western-dominated order we see today. Instead, the Soviet Union would carve out its own global economy, trading with allies across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It would become a zone separate from the West, where capitalism is heavily curtailed and communism is front and center. Capitalism would exist in name only, controlled and directed by the Communist Party. Without this new economic order, many of today's assumptions would be challenged. For example, China's rise would look very different. Today, China is the main rival to American power. But if the USSR still existed, Beijing might have been either a close partner in a communist alliance or a dangerous rival competing for influence over developing nations. A Soviet-Chinese alliance would create an unstoppable bloc, controlling much of Eurasia's resources and dominating global trade. On the other hand, if tensions flared between Moscow and Beijing, the Cold War might have been a three-way struggle, with the US, USSR, and China all competing for dominance. The relationship between Russia and China is already quite close today. In fact, they share a 2,600-mile-long border, meeting in places like Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. If the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed, these borders might not exist. The current borders between Russia and China were actually established by the Treaty of 1860 and 1991, when both countries were led by foreign powers. If the Soviet Union still existed, the borders between Russia and China may have been renegotiated, potentially changing the political dynamic in Asia. Some experts believe that Soviet influence over Central Asia would have kept Chinese expansion in check, especially regarding Taiwan. With a Soviet-aligned China, it's possible that Beijing wouldn't have felt as threatened by Taiwan's independence leaning towards the US-led camp. The absence of the Soviet Union might have emboldened China to take more aggressive steps against Taiwan. Similarly, the Soviet Union's collapse left a power vacuum in Eastern Europe. Without this vacuum, NATO would likely be less prominent. Poland might not have joined the alliance, and countries like Hungary and Romania would probably remain non-aligned. The European continent would be divided between the Western and Eastern blocs, diminishing the significance of EU membership. Technology and the Internet would also be reshaped. The Western Internet, led by US companies like Google, Facebook, and Apple, might not dominate globally. Instead, the Soviet Union could have created its own closed Internet system, with state-controlled platforms and networks spanning its territory and allied nations. It's even possible that Russian would have overtaken English as the primary language of the Internet due to the sheer number of speakers. This linguistic shift could have profound effects on global communication, online communities, and even search engine algorithms. Imagine growing up in a world where Russian is dominant online, shaping how information is organized and presented. The Soviet Union's vast size and technical expertise in fields like aerospace and engineering mean that its space program would have continued to thrive. With the backing of the Communist Party, it's likely that the USSR would have achieved several milestones earlier than in our timeline. This could range from launching the first satellite to sending the first person into space, advancing space exploration in the process. The race for technological supremacy between the US and USSR would likely have intensified, leading to innovations like faster computers, better telecommunications, and increased military spending on advanced weapons and defense systems. However, with tighter government control over technology and information access, there would have been a greater emphasis on national security and potentially less freedom of expression online. But what if the Soviet Union had never fallen? It's likely that ethnic and nationalist tensions, which actually did help cause its collapse in our timeline, would still simmer under the surface. Keeping 15 republics under one flag would require constant political control, propaganda, and possibly the suppression of uprisings. As a result, domestic politics within the USSR would be turbulent, characterized by a balance between repression and reform. In fact, leaders like Gorbachev might have had an even greater impact if they had a stronger, more stable Soviet state to work with. At the same time, external pressures could have pushed the USSR to become more open. As the Cold War progressed and Western economies boomed, living standards might have increased in the Soviet Union. However, this increase would be tightly controlled, allowing only enough prosperity to prevent unrest while maintaining the party's grip on power. Furthermore, economic disparities between the republics could have widened, leading to resentment and demands for greater autonomy. This tension could have been managed through a combination of carrots and sticks, with the threat of losing control being balanced against the promise of greater prosperity. But what about culture? If the Soviet Union still existed today, Hollywood's dominance might be challenged by a massive Soviet film and propaganda machine. Imagine growing up with a steady diet of Soviet blockbusters, slick action films, sci-fi epics, and musicals, all promoting communist ideology. These movies might blend the best of American storytelling with the grandeur of European art cinema, but always with a strong dose of politics. The world would be filled with the names of legendary Soviet actors and directors who might have influenced generations more than they already have in our timeline. International sports would also continue to be a battleground for Cold War supremacy. Victories in Olympic competitions might have been seen as less about athleticism and more about demonstrating the superiority of each nation's political system. Every medal won would be a propaganda victory. And athletes would be more than competitors. They would be cultural ambassadors for their country. Pop culture icons, from musicians to fashion designers, would be infused with political messages, reflecting the values and rivalries of the Cold War era. It's conceivable that songs about resistance, revolution, and international solidarity would fill the airwaves. But perhaps the biggest question is global stability. The United States would never enjoy the unipolar dominance it gained after 1991. The end of the Cold War allowed America to project its power globally without significant opposition. Conflicts like the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan might never have happened or would be approached very differently, as Washington would fear Soviet involvement. Even NATO might not exist as it does today. Eastern Europe might remain firmly in the Soviet sphere, and the alliance might be smaller or less influential, with Europe divided between East and West. Furthermore, the nature of warfare would be different. Conflicts would not be as straightforward as they are today. The specter of nuclear war would loom over every conflict. Even a small regional war could escalate quickly, potentially drawing in the two superpowers and sparking a global catastrophe. The world would be more divided, less connected, and far more dangerous. Technology, culture, and politics would all be split between two superpowers locked in constant rivalry. Some might benefit from a stronger socialist system, but others would live under heavy restrictions and censorship. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't just change one country, it changed the entire planet. In hindsight, the end of the USSR was a pivotal moment that reshaped geopolitics. The world became more interconnected and reliant on free market principles. The fall of communism as a viable political system seemed imminent. But what if this trajectory had been altered? The Soviet Union's collapse left a power vacuum that the United States was able to capitalize on. Its absence changed the political dynamics of the entire globe. Could the Soviet Union have maintained its territories and influence throughout the 21st century? Could it have successfully competed economically with the West? Would it have used its power to support allies abroad? Or would it have pursued a more isolationist approach? What would the world be like today if the Soviet Union had never fallen? Perhaps most importantly, how would we have managed to live with the threat of nuclear war throughout the 21st century? It's a chilling thought that gives us pause to consider the fragility of our current global order and the importance of understanding our past to navigate our future. Thank you so much for watching.